Thank you for joining us for this presentation on Housing Action Plan Best Practices. My name is Todd Stubendek. I'm the State Director of AARP Nebraska. AARP has been working to promote the health and well-being of older Americans for more than 60 years through information, advocacy, and resources. Part of that includes helping to improve the places that we live so people can age in place and thrive no matter their age, ability, or background. Our work in this area is known as livable communities, and ultimately our vision is for a future in which our communities, urban, suburban, and rural, are great places for all of us. We are very pleased today to be joined by Tyler Bump and Becky Hewitt from ECONorthwest, who are going to share with us their expertise and talk about Housing Action Plan best practices, including a discussion about affordable, workforce, and middle housing. Just a few words on logistics. Tyler and Becky's presentation will be in two parts today, and we'll do a Q&A session after each. So feel free to either put questions in the chat and I'll gather them and we'll ask them when we get to the Q&A, or since we're a small enough group, I think we can also open it up and people can ask their questions directly. Typical Zoom meeting reminder, we ask that everyone stay on mute throughout the presentation. With that, I want to welcome Tyler and Becky and thank them for joining us today. Take it away.
Thank you, Todd. Before we get moving, I'll give a quick introduction for myself and then I'll pass it over to Becky and then I'll get moving on the conversation. In the presentation, my name is Tyler Bump. I'm a project director at ECONorthwest. Part of my job here at our firm is to lead our practice, what we call urban systems, which includes our housing and development policy work. As a firm, we've worked on easily over 100 housing action plan, housing production strategy, housing needs assessment type projects for jurisdictions, predominantly on the West Coast, but all over the country as well. And so we're very familiar with sort of housing action plan best practices and different requirements across different states and how to approach some of these questions at a local level with local context. Becky, would you give a quick introduction for yourself?
Sure. I'm Becky Hewitt. I am a senior project manager at ECONorthwest. And my background is in land use planning and code writing, as well as degrees in planning and real estate development, and have been working with Tyler on a lot of our middle housing work in Oregon in particular, but then also, as he mentioned, increasingly across the country as well, as interest in middle housing expands. So yeah, excited to hear your thoughts and your questions as we get into discussion later in the session.
All right, thank you, Becky. If we can go to the next slide, we'll get moving with the agenda for the meeting. As Todd mentioned, we've got two parts of our presentation today. Part one, talking about housing action planning and affordable and workforce housing and how to think through some of these questions and issues, like setting appropriate and achievable affordable housing goals, affordable and workforce housing development basics, and potential local level strategies to support and incentivize affordable and workforce housing. Part two, we're going to focus on middle housing. I know for a lot of you, this probably isn't your first presentation on middle housing, but we are going to be diving a little bit more into the cost and the market and some other things related to middle housing that I think will be a lot of new information for you as well today. We're going to pause for some questions in between part one and part two, just to make sure that we can answer those as they come up as well. Next slide, please. So the first part of our presentation, affordable and workforce housing. Next slide. So one quick note on setting housing goals. We looked through the sort of basics or requirements as part of LB 866. In terms of estimating housing need in Nebraska for jurisdictions and counties across Nebraska, most jurisdictions are looking at recent housing production by type of housing. So that's the development trends analysis on what's getting built, what are the price points of those units getting built, demographic analysis of what are the household compositions, and understanding the lay of the land for demographic need and the relationship to housing. Estimates of housing need by type and price range, which I will say that there's lots of different approaches that folks take about how to determine need by type and price. And then estimated local housing costs. So what are the estimated local housing costs? And then part of our best practices related to local housing costs is really understanding tenure and the type of housing related to local housing costs as part of housing action plans as well. Some other considerations and best practices that we have found and integrated into our work, looking at historical underproduction. So what's the rate of housing production relative to household growth? What we find oftentimes is that cities are building housing, but starting from a place of deficit sometimes. So you might not have enough housing right now to meet your current need. And so as we forecast future need, it's important to also understand what the current rates of underproduction are to account for that. So oftentimes we'll have, when we do this work, we'll have a current housing need, which reflects underproduction, and a future housing need, which reflects more of the sort of planning long-range forecast. One of the other things that we do is look at cost-burdened households. This is data that's broadly available in the census, but looking at cost burdening, again, by tenure. Usually we'll focus in on cost-burdened households and drill in on policy interventions for cost-burdened renter households specifically. But looking at cost burdening across different household categories is also important. Related to this cost burdening piece, depending on the level of data availability, we sometimes use what's called PUMS data to look at cost burdening by different household types as well, and breaking that down either by race and ethnicity or household type to get a more nuanced understanding of what cost burdening looks like for different kinds of households. PUMS data is an interesting data set that is mostly relevant, I would say, for urban and suburban jurisdictions because of the size of geography that's needed and the sample size required for that PUMS data. But that's a good data source to look to as well as you all are doing this work. Another consideration is housing the unhoused. So how do we think about integrating any information that jurisdictions have on homeless populations and how to serve folks that are currently unhoused in your communities and how to account for that in the housing needs conversation. Thinking about housing replacement over time, and then vacancy rates. Vacancy rates is a big one that we think about in hot markets and sort of more medium markets as well, where vacancy rates can have a large impact on housing availability and housing price, especially in communities with low vacancy rates. And then we look at disparities in housing. And so I think this is sort of real emerging best practice and trend right here is looking at folks specifically at sort of racial equity and doing a racial equity analysis on disparities in housing and other household types that have disparities. We've done some work for households with developmental disabilities, for example. And so there's different disparities in housing that different populations specifically need. And so looking at those housing needs by population, special needs populations is also helpful. Next slide, please. So when we think about affordable and workforce housing in the context of an overall housing production strategy, we've got in sort of our minds this framework of three different categories of housing that kind of overlap depending on the income levels. So we've got affordable housing that's predominantly developed by nonprofit or sometimes mission-driven developers. Usually this housing is in the 0 to 30, the extremely low income housing category, or 30 to 60% AMI category. In the middle, we've got this, what we call mixed income or shallow affordability by market rate developers. And generally the 60% to 100, 120% AMI category. And this can be characterized oftentimes as workforce housing, middle income housing, but sometimes does need some public assistance or public subsidy. Sometimes can benefit, always benefit from regulatory improvements and process improvements. But also can be taken care of by market rate developers, depending on your regulatory environment and actors within your communities. And then at the upper end of the spectrum, we have more of the sort of traditional market rate housing that can be lower cost market rate housing, but how to really think about regulations to support lower cost but market rate housing on the upper end of the income spectrum. Next slide, please. All right. We also have this sort of spectrum of strategies to support housing production that we think about. And these are sort of organized, I would say, thematically by impact. And that is the level of impact on housing affordability, from less impactful on the left to more impactful on the right. As we talk through these, there can also be a financial or budgetary implication of less impactful and more impactful. So on the far left side of less impactful, produce informational resources. So help guidebooks, sort of FAQs type of information to help both nonprofit and for-profit affordable housing developers navigate your regulatory permitting system. Partner to leverage efforts and resources. This would be partnering with other government agencies, counties, regional planning agencies, regional planning organizations, and other nonprofit, both local and national affordable housing providers. Removing regulatory barriers in the middle here. We do a lot of work with long-range planning and current planning departments around removing regulatory barriers to support more housing. This is one I would say that a lot of our clients typically focus on because it has moderate impact and the least cost implications for a city that might not have the financial resources to contribute to direct financing or land acquisition and disposition on the other end of the spectrum. Permit fee waivers, waive or reduce upfront or ongoing charges on development. That can be permit fees or infrastructure impact fees. I know that there's state level implications and local level infrastructure funding implications for this as well. But most of the jurisdictions that we work with generally have some combination of these two in the middle of regulatory barriers and financial incentives around permit fee or infrastructure fee waivers. And then we get to more impactful, also a little bit more expensive, is the allocate funding. And this is sort of direct financial resources to support workforce or affordable housing development, and then land acquisition and disposition on the far side. And there are a number of communities and jurisdictions that have existing land that cities may own. It could be owned by various development authorities. It could be owned by the cities themselves, but also thinking about the city's existing resources in terms of land ownership and what that can mean in thinking about affordable housing and making that land available for affordable housing development. Next slide, please. So some local level strategies to support new affordable housing, just to go over these at a sort of high level. I know that in Nebraska, you all use tax increment financing with affordability requirements as an important tool in funding affordable housing, which is really great and limited in other states that we work in, and is a good tool to be able to use and deploy for affordable housing. Locally controlled funds for affordable housing. Some local jurisdictions, either at a city level, county level, or a region level, have affordable housing fund, affordable housing trust fund type resources available. I know that there's a new state housing trust fund that will have resources available for jurisdictions to access as well. But there are some oftentimes locally controlled funds for affordable housing as part of a fund. Surplus land and land disposition. So thinking about the land that the cities or government partners, agency partners might have to make available for affordable housing. Impact fee and permitting fee waivers can be helpful and certainly can help in terms of facilitating a process for affordable housing, whether that's in mixed income housing, mixed income development project, or in a pure development or a pure affordable housing development. Code incentives and flexibility. Density is a big one. Parking, we find, is oftentimes one of the biggest challenges, both in physical feasibility of getting developments, affordable housing developments to fit on a site, as well as allowing nonprofit affordable housing providers to build more units to be able to satisfy more demand for their certain household needs for affordability. And then some other ones thinking about height and setbacks, but any of the development standards that you as a community, as a jurisdiction might have, and think about incentives and flexibility for affordable housing. And then a streamlined review process. There are a lot of jurisdictions that allow a sort of fast track process, permitting review process for affordable housing development or market rate projects that include affordable housing components in a mixed income project. I know that also want to recognize that many jurisdictions try to make their process as streamlined as possible to begin with. And oftentimes there's not a lot of wiggle room to try to make things quicker or faster. But for those of you that may have some opportunities there, that is an opportunity to think about another strategy. Next slide. And so these are some other strategies that we think about in terms of stabilization and anti-displacement placement. The last slide was really about new housing and new development. These are some of the things that we think about in terms of stabilizing existing households and thinking about anti-displacement. So rental housing stabilization, acquisition and preservation. So is there naturally occurring affordable housing that might be at risk of not being affordable long-term? Are there expiring affordability requirements associated with some affordable housing? What can local jurisdictions do to preserve expiring regulated affordable units? Incentives for owners of rental properties to stabilize their rents. There are lots of ways that cities have taken to work with private property owners to stabilize their rents, whether that's through an ongoing compliance process or more of a naturally occurring approach. There's different approaches there. And then preserving manufactured homes, manufactured housing parks. This is one, both a code and a program approach that we find a lot of jurisdictions are taking right now, because it is one of the sort of lowest hanging fruit really for preservation and thinking about manufactured homes in the overall housing supply and affordability spectrum. In terms of renter household support, so rent assistance can be direct rent assistance from different funding sources, whether that's vouchers, whether it's federal assistance or local assistance, and different ways for rental assistance. I know that many of you are probably have some form of rental assistance with COVID recovery funding already right now. And so how can you all think about that longer term as a strategy? Tenant rights. So there's lots of different notification requirements and sort of tenant rights or stability for renter households that we work with jurisdictions on, and then source of income protection. So thinking about the household incomes and source of income and making sure that folks are eligible for existing multifamily rental housing, both regulated and non-regulated within communities. And then homeowner household supports, thinking about assistance with maintenance and repairs for low-income homeowners. There are a lot of jurisdictions that use federal programs for weatherization improvements, federal resources for weatherization improvements that have that as a funding source and program source to work with targeted homeowners, oftentimes senior households, to think about low repairs and improvements related to weatherization. And then low income and first time home buyer support programs can be super helpful. Training programs, down payment assistance, other financial programs associated with first time home buyer. Next slide, please. Maybe we can open it up for some questions before we move to our middle housing section.
Todd, this might also be a good time for us to do our poll for folks.
Yeah, why don't we put up the poll we have, and if you have a question, please feel free to jump on and ask. Don't be shy. We're all Nebraskans, I know, but please feel free to jump in.
I'm just really hoping we have access to slides afterwards too.
Yes, Laura, there will be slides available, and we will make sure the recording of the program gets out to folks as well. So,
awesome. Thank you so much. This is great information.
Yeah. So Becky, do you want to talk a little bit about the poll?
Sure. Yeah, we're just curious. I know not all of you are here representing local governments, but particularly for those who are, and for, maybe also for those who are supporting local governments and working through implementing LB 866, just kind of where things stand. We looked through, as Tyler said, we looked through a lot of the documents that jurisdictions submitted earlier this year, and as Tyler said, there was a real range of kind of how much prior work we could see that people were drawing from, and so yeah, just sort of curious of how folks are feeling about implementing the new legislation, and it looks like. Do we want to, I'm not sure if we have everybody, we may have everybody who is representing a local government. So yeah, it looks like it's about a 50-50 split between jurisdictions that are doubling down on work that they've already started or have been wanting to do, but feeling like they have a ways to go. And then folks that are feeling like they're kind of at square one, interested, but don't have much to go on yet, and starting at the beginning. So yeah, that's good to hear.
Hey, Becky and Tyler, while we're waiting for someone, if someone else wants to jump in, I did talk to a couple of the folks who couldn't be with us today that were looking forward to the recording and asked them if they had questions. And I got a couple of those, and maybe I'll sneak one in here and
sure.
Wait and see if anyone else too. So questions I got were sort of, with this housing action plan, what's the best practice? What's the point at which you engage the public in this process? Do you have thoughts on of timing for that? What part of the process, how to go about doing that?
I can, maybe Becky, I'll start and then you can jump in. I think it's kind of context sensitive, really, and local, what's specific to your local jurisdiction. One of our sort of best practices of what we're doing now in terms of engagement is reaching out to community organizations and nonprofits at the beginning of the process, to make sure that as we're pulling the data and information, we're getting the right information and finding the right nuggets of key findings in the data that reflect the reality of folks that are either cost burdened or housing insecure or have specific housing needs, to understand what those look like. So part of it is soliciting feedback from those folks, and part of it is just validating what we're finding in the data. So usually a sort of draft of the housing action plan or housing needs assessment data is when we'll sort of loop back with community organizations and say, this is what we're finding. Does this make sense to you? And then have some conversations around strategies and needs a little bit with them at that point. I have found that having conversations with planning commission, council committees, and city councils in a briefing way of having multiple briefings is a really, really good way to bring decision makers along as well. And being, collaborative, honestly, with decision makers around what we're doing and why we're looking at things. So I would say early and often, as planners tend to want to do as often as we can, in terms of engagement. In more urban communities too, and suburban communities, even rural communities, really knowing the community organizations and the nonprofits that are doing the work, and engaging with them early is also super important.
Well, that ties into the other question I had was I think a lot of times those stakeholders, partners are kind of, obvious. People work with them. Are there some non-traditional stakeholders and partners that people should be thinking about that you see occurring in other places that are bringing in some different ideas in that regard?
Yeah, I'll name a couple of projects that I've worked on recently, and then I'll hand it over to Becky. We've recently engaged, starting to work more with human services organizations in addition to housing providers, to bring a different perspective along with the service need and human service provisions along with housing need, especially for affordable housing. And so as we've done that, we've connected with different organizations that we otherwise wouldn't have reached. We've started to engage with LGBTQ organizations in a way to think about housing needs. We've started to engage with organizations that work with folks with developmental or physical disabilities and what housing needs are for folks there. We are also seeing sort of broader coalitions starting to build in some of the regions and communities that we work that include a lot of those folks, that include a lot of sort of community development, anti-displacement organizations, and that honestly are starting to include more local architects and local developers as part of those coalitions as well. And so I think in our work, we're starting to see the tent get a little bit bigger, and some of these coalitions getting more integrated into what they're thinking about housing needs longer term. Becky, do you have any other thoughts on that question?
I guess a little bit more back to the prior question, just to build on some of what Tyler said. I think using a mixture of the kind of grass tops, service providers, community-based organizations, and then also using those organizations to tap into some of the clients that they work with, and do interviews or focus groups or things like that, and kind of hear first-person stories from people who may be experiencing housing challenges. And I think that serves two purposes. One is, I think when you do that early in the plan, it really helps provide context and understand, you can pull cost burdening data, but I think it really helps put a finer point on what the consequences of that are and what that experience is like for people. And then maybe some of the what's driving their housing challenges, what's behind it, because I think that can help you inform the strategies that are going to be most helpful. And it also, I think when you can take those kind of first person accounts, I find that can be very compelling for your local elected officials. And it also, if you can, get verbatim quotes, and you can, put them with pictures or things like make it a little bit more tangible and human for people. Because those folks may have a harder time showing up to hearings, and they may not be as present when you get to the more technical part of the process. And so I think that getting their voices kind of captured and documented early in a way that you can save and share and kind of bring them forward into the places where their voice needs to be heard. I think that can be really helpful in keeping that balance between some of the more, kind of keep things as they are voices that tend to come out, particularly late in the process, and the understanding that there are people in the community who would really benefit from some of the changes.
Makes sense. I'd also throw in partnering with AARP to get the perspective of your over 50 population as well. Just a shameless plug there. So
absolutely.
I'll pause and let's see if anyone else has any other questions. If not, I'll turn it back over. You guys can jump in.
Yeah, Todd, real quick on the stakeholder piece. AARP, I will say, I've been involved in housing policy conversations that have been organized by AARP, and they've been some of the most effective conversations that I've seen in terms of new housing policy. Along the sort of age spectrum of housing needs, oftentimes we're thinking about a 20-year planning horizon timeframe for housing needs. And I've recently worked on a housing action plan in Tukwila, Washington, where we engaged 8th graders and freshmen in high school about housing needs, because they are really the ones in 15 years that are going to be the ones looking for housing, needing housing. And it was just amazing to hear their experiences of their family's housing, and how they've had to move, or how the differences in experiences around housing with some youth too. And that was just, I don't know, it was amazing engagement. They came and testified at Planning Commission, and it was very well received. That led to actionable strategies. Their feedback led to actionable strategies on that project.
I think one of the interesting things as we've gotten into this is what we've found is that what younger people are looking for in housing and what older people are looking for housing very much mesh together, which creates some unique opportunities to be developing housing that really has an intergenerational feel to it, because those two age groups, while on different ends of the age spectrum, are looking for the same sort of thing in their housing options. So
we have a graphic that will show that pretty well later on in our presentation.
Okay, maybe we'll go back to it. And if folks do have questions, if you feel more comfortable putting them in the chat, that is just fine. And we can pick them up. We can pick them up when we get to the end of this piece. And we can always circle back to stuff from the housing action plans as well, and kind of think about how these pieces fit together.
All right. So the second half of our presentation, talking about middle housing. I'm sure most, if not all of you, have seen this transect diagram from Opticos Design about what is middle housing, and missing middle housing being that sort of duplex through sort of courtyard housing, live work. Opticos talks about this as sort of lower middle housing and upper middle housing. So lower being duplex, triplex, fourplex, townhouse type middle housing, all the way up to a little bit higher medium density middle housing as well. I know that the state legislation that we're talking about really does have some implications on lower middle housing being duplex, triplex, fourplex, and townhomes as well, which is also the case in other states where we're working with the state middle housing context as well. It's really the lower end of the middle housing here. Next slide, please. Probably most of you all are familiar with this example. This is an example that Opticos recently shared in a presentation that we were working on with them in the Bay Area. But this is a local example, the bungalows on the lake at Prairie Queen. So it's a 50-acre master plan development with 742 dwelling units with a mix of building types, duplex, fourplex, small and large, multiplex, multifamily housing, and townhomes as well. So in terms of new sort of master plan development, one of the best examples of this is in Nebraska. And so we just wanted to share that and give a shout out to Nebraska for this great example. So why encourage middle housing? Our lens on middle housing as a sort of implementation economics focused planning firm is a little bit different. So why encourage middle housing? Smaller unit sizes and more housing choice. We know that there's a demand, to get to Todd's point earlier, there's a demand for different types of housing that hasn't really been met over the last 20 to 30 years of new development. And so how can we think about different housing choices in different ways? Potential for multi-generational housing. I'll share with you some slides following up on this, but generally middle housing is lower cost than new detached housing, and that's pretty consistent across all of the markets that we work in. And you'll see some examples of some very high cost markets that we'll show you. High cost markets, low cost markets, middle housing is generally less expensive. Integrates well with single family neighborhoods and existing neighborhood characteristics. Potential for greater socioeconomic housing types, sizes and price points within neighborhoods. So thinking more about sort of mixed income neighborhoods and opportunities for folks to have access to different neighborhoods at different price points. And expand housing supply in areas with little available land. So an opportunity to think about middle housing in an infill context as well. Next slide. All right, so this is some information that Becky just pulled this morning, hot off the press for Nebraska. But the difference in single family versus townhome pricing for recent construction in Lincoln. So we've got this range, this bell curve of single family home sales prices as of this month, October 2021, for the last 6 months of homes built since 2010. So this is new construction, homes that have relatively new construction built since 2010, homes that have sold within the last 6 months. So the majority of homes in Lincoln selling mostly between 300,000 and 500,000 or so. And then we've got new construction townhomes. So you can see here in the chart that new construction townhomes generally are quite a bit more affordable, less expensive than detached single family. Not really surprising to us to see this thing, but townhomes can often be smaller, and smaller units are generally less expensive than bigger units. And then you've got the land efficiency that's associated with smaller underlying parcels or underlying land that's associated with those units as well. But again, this is something that we see pretty much consistently across the jurisdictions or markets that we work. Next slide, please. This is an example in Oregon where we looked at estimated new construction feasibility of different housing types and different housing price points. And so in this market in Washington County, which is a suburban county, suburban jurisdiction outside of Portland, we looked at single family, both medium and small lot sizes. And so the highest price there between about $600,000 and $700,000 for a new construction detached single family on a medium lot size. More land efficiency, but still a detached. You get a little bit less expensive, more affordable. And then as you go down into getting these more dense middle housing types, housing costs drop pretty significantly. And so these are non-subsidized, less expensive housing that can be achieved from regulatory changes and allowing more uses throughout the urban unincorporated areas of Washington County that we were looking at here. This is the wild example of housing prices. This is the San Francisco Bay Area. We're doing some work for the Association of Bay Area Governments with Opticos Design right now. But the yellow lines that are the most expensive lines that range from 1.5 million in 2011 up to 3.5 million in 2021. The numbers are just crazy to see those housing costs. It's more of the trend that I think is the important thing, that we see townhomes, both existing and new townhomes, coming in significantly less in cost compared to single family. Again, these prices are wild for this market, but the relationship between middle housing pricing and detached single family is pretty consistent across all of the jurisdictions that we're working. So one quick note on middle housing affordability range. This is from a chart that we worked with in Eugene, Oregon. So a college town, mid-sized city in Oregon and Eugene, that most new middle housing is affordable, generally between about 80% to 120% AMI, and provided options for new construction that just were not close to achievable for detached single family new construction. And this is, I think, a helpful tool for folks to think about how to communicate, even in the context of a housing action plan, ranges of affordability by housing type and how that relates to AMI levels, affordable monthly housing costs, and then this occupational component too of what is a standard income for this AMI and monthly income. So we've used these examples that are a little bit specific to Eugene, Oregon, with a logging equipment operator at about 90% AMI. But what we see here is that this is a way, middle housing is a way to get new construction development that could be affordable to the average annual wage and average median incomes in Eugene, which otherwise is pretty challenging to do with predominantly single family detached. Possible with multifamily attached, but not as much with single family detached. Next slide, please. And here's the chart, Todd, that you had a good segue for us earlier. What's the market for middle housing? So who is interested in middle housing as a product? Generally households seeking smaller homes, lower cost housing in desirable areas, households looking for more environmentally sustainable housing with less of an impact, physical impact and environmental impact, and multi-generational housing. So some of the sort of core markets or demand segments that we think about for middle housing is seniors that might be seeking lower maintenance housing, that might have specific needs for accessibility or universal design longer term as well. A lot of folks are also looking to downsize. So might have had a larger single family detached house and aren't a lot of options available to downsize into an ownership unit. And so thinking about smaller, more options that are smaller for seniors. Younger households and first-time home buyers, sort of needs there are attainable pricing and programmatic supports for home ownership in some cases. But smaller middle housing can certainly be less expensive for home ownership for first-time home buyers and younger households. And then also single person and single parent households. So needing smaller units, and then also rental and home ownership opportunities, both 10 years available for single person and single parent households as well. And we've got this graphic that we've put together of thinking kind of about life cycle housing needs and how folks move and transition in their housing needs over the course of their life, and to think about multi-generational housing and what that looks like across the spectrum of one's age as well. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Becky.
Thanks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the barriers that we see from a regulatory perspective with middle housing and some of the best practices that address those barriers. And this is from work across a lot of jurisdictions and seeing a lot of different approaches. So one of the things we sometimes see is that communities will say, "Oh, we allow middle housing." Yeah, it's allowed. You have to go through a conditional use permit, and all your neighbors have to be invited to a meeting where you're going to talk about it, but it's allowed. And that kind of a discretionary review process that says, well, maybe you can do it, that adds a lot of uncertainty. It usually adds time. And those two things together add cost and discourage that type of development, especially if single family development is easy and straightforward and straight to building permit. How big a deal that is, it depends on how slow, how cumbersome, how uncertain that process is. But anything where you're going to invite the adjacent property owners to come out and comment on whether they would like something other than a single family detached home built next to them is going to tend to be a real challenge and a real obstacle to middle housing production. So it's pretty important, if you do want to allow middle housing, to allow it by right, not through a special additional review process that you wouldn't put a single family home through. In Oregon, we have a lot of emphasis on clear and objective standards, meaning that Todd and I could both read them and interpret them the same way. And there wouldn't be a question about whether whether a given building would meet them or not. And because of that, you don't need the same opportunities for input and for discretionary review as you would if you had standards that were more about how it looks or feels, and were a little more broad and general. And so you can have standards that address design and look and feel, and that are still clear and objective. They tend to be a little bit simpler, but you can still get at some of the things that matter most about having windows or doors facing the street, things like that, that address some of the concerns that people can have about design. You can still do that with clear and objective standards. It's just a little bit, maybe takes a little bit more work to kind of spell out exactly what would meet, what exactly are you looking for. And then once you have clear and objective standards in place, then you can use a staff or ministerial review process that's pretty straightforward, and that doesn't require big public meetings or planning commission to be involved or things like that. So that kind of package of having it allowed as of right, having standards that are clear and objective, those are all the things that you would need to get to a point where you can have this simplified review process.
Hey, Becky, one quick note on this one. Generally, if jurisdictions are interested in seeing middle housing built in their communities, we make a broad recommendation that don't make middle housing harder to do than single family development. So at a minimum, don't create any additional barriers for middle housing if that's what you want to see. And if you wanted to see that above other housing types, think about code, regulatory process improvements to be able to make that happen as well. So at a high level, don't make it more difficult than detached single family if what you want to see is more middle housing in your community.
And that theme kind of carries through some of these next topics as well. The overall idea that if the regulations you put in place are more costly, more cumbersome, or more restrictive than what you're applying to single family housing, that's going to be a real uphill battle for middle housing to get produced. And even if they are the same as single family, sometimes that is because there are so many market forces that tend to favor single family. Even having things be sort of level between single family and middle housing sometimes is still not enough to really support middle housing production. So an example of this is density limits. If you were to apply the same density limit that you apply to single family housing, and I have seen this in some communities, it's like, sure, you can build a duplex. Each one of them needs the same size lot as a single family home. Why would I build a duplex and stick them together if I need two single family home lots and I could just have two single family homes? So allowing middle housing to be built at a density that's much higher than what you would allow for single family is pretty important if you want to see it built. Again, with a house scale building, the idea is that there are several units in that volume that's the size of a house, but overall it's more, you're thinking of the building more like as if it was one house than as if it was four houses, for example, with a fourplex. And so thinking about it focused on the scale of the housing types that are allowed, rather than focusing on the unit count and on units per acre density. And some places, it's, the multifamily zoning is the place where middle housing is intended to happen. But even there, sometimes the density can be too low, because the density that might be about right on a very large site with a sort of garden style apartment building can be too small or too low when you have just a couple units on a lot the size of a single family lot. Because when you do the math on 4 units on a 7,000 square foot lot, that density comes out pretty high. So the best practice there, again, is either say, you know what, for duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, our density standards don't apply, and we're going to just allow them subject to scale standards or, you know, floor area, that kind of thing. Or to say, okay, I've done the math. I want to allow fourplexes on 7,000 square foot lots. And in order to do that, this is the density that I need to be allowing. And I'm going to apply that density instead. Remembering that if you also allow single family homes at that density, you may get those. You may just get more single family homes on smaller lots. So that's just something to think about. And the approach that Oregon's model code legislation for middle housing took is just to allow housing types based on the lot size. So any home that allows a single family home is allowed to have a duplex. And then lots over 5,000 square feet are allowed to have a triplex, unless your single family homes require a larger lot than that. Same. Fourplexes, 7,000 square feet or same size as a single family home. So taking that kind of an approach, it says, you know what, let's not try to treat this as a units per acre thing. Let's just say the lots are basically the same as a single family lot, unless we are talking about single family lots that are very, very small. Parking requirements are another big one. And again, another one where even the standards you would apply to single family may be too much. Parking is somewhat expensive, but its biggest issue is that it takes up a lot of space. And especially if you're talking about smaller units and smaller sites, you can get to the point where the only thing that fits on the site is the parking. It also, the more parking you have to have, the more your building can end up looking like the one shown here, where it's all driveway and all garage, and there's not so much housing left, and you're not necessarily enjoying looking at their giant parking lot and all their garages. It's important to think about the unit size with your parking requirements for middle housing. It is pretty rarely going to work well if you require more than one space per unit. Townhouses may be able to handle more than one space per unit, but other middle housing types, that's generally not going to work very well. And for smaller units, even one space per unit, if you're trying to get 4 small units on a small site, that can be too much. Now, whether having less than 1 car per household is realistic kind of depends on where you are, what community you're in, and then where you are in that community and what kind of demographics you're talking about. So Opticos tends to talk about focusing on places that lend themselves to being more walkable. And I think that's, if you're unsure about being able to reduce the parking ratio, that's a good place to start with places that are more walkable. If there is transit service, if you can walk to a little downtown or to schools and things like that, what are the reasons why people might not need to have a car? And then also, who's likely to be living in this housing and how many cars do they have? You also see sometimes at a large single family home might have 3 or 4 vehicles if they have teenage children or things like that. Whereas a small, triplex or fourplex with several small units might also have just a couple of vehicles across all of those households. So thinking about the different types of households that might be living in these different types of housing. And then there are issues about the site, the layout of the site. So things like lot coverage and setbacks. And this is another graphic that we got from Opticos. You can see our partnership with them showing up in some of our slides here. For jurisdictions that are thinking about how their multifamily standards apply to middle housing, you sometimes see standards that require multifamily to have these larger setbacks, particularly if they're next to single family and things like that. And when you think about that for a smaller lot that's more the size of a single family home, all of a sudden there's nothing left for the building anymore. And even if you're thinking about the standards that apply to single family, and that's where Oregon starts, is, start from applying the same standards you would apply to a single family home. And that's a good starting point, but sometimes that's a little bit too restrictive if your standards are like, you can only have 20% of the lot covered by a building or things like that. You might be constraining middle housing to be so small that it's hard to get multiple units into that space. So this is, again, that same theme, that the standards for middle housing should not be any more restrictive than they are for single family. And then think about whether you need to create a little bit additional flexibility for middle housing so that there's a little bit more room to put a couple additional units while keeping that overall kind of house scale, that it's not taking up the whole lot if you would only allow a single family home to take up a small fraction of the lot, for example. And then some of the other factors that are really outside of the zoning code, but they're important for local governments that are thinking about middle housing regulations to be aware of and to think about. It is possible to convert single family homes to middle housing, but particularly if you get into trying to convert to 3 or 4 or more units, you tend to trigger a lot of building code issues that can be expensive and difficult to address on an old house. I think allowing for conversion is a great idea, but I wouldn't assume that you're going to get lots and lots of conversions to multiplexes if you do allow it. And then it kind of in the theme of the idea that middle housing is generally, if you're allowing it in an area that also allows single family, it's kind of competing with single family for what's going to get built on a given lot. And things like how you set your impact fees, how much it costs to hook up 2 sewer connections versus 1 sewer connection, whether you're requiring properties to improve, add sidewalks or curb and gutter if they're coming into an infill lot that maybe doesn't have all those things up to standards. All of those things affect housing feasibility generally, but they really affect middle housing feasibility and this decision between whether you're going to build 1 unit or 3. And so thinking about how your rate structures work and what kind of costs development might trigger if it comes in with multiple units that it wouldn't trigger if it comes in with a single unit are important to try to support housing production for middle housing. And then also, most of what we've talked about, these are things that apply to market rate middle housing, but they also apply to affordable housing developers. There are some challenges with building affordable housing at a middle housing scale, but it does happen. And there are folks like Habitat for Humanity, for example, that this is one of the things they do. In some places, they only do detached housing. In some places, all they do is attached housing. And so when they have opportunities to build attached, they tend to do it because it's a little bit more cost effective for them. And they can get, as Tyler was saying, they can get more units out of that same amount of land and provide more housing for more families. And then another factor is fee simple ownership versus condominium ownership. So both developers and home buyers tend to prefer to have the house and the land under the house sold together. So that would be things like a townhouse. And in many states, there are liability issues associated with building condominiums that tend to be off-putting for developers. And then for the home buyer, then buying a condominium, then you have homeowners association dues and things like that reduce how much you can afford to spend on the mortgage because you're spending more on these other ongoing costs. So thinking about whether you're allowing middle housing to be on its own lot, you may not regulate tenure in your community, but if you create opportunities for fee simple ownership, you're more likely to see middle housing production and uptake from developers, because there are these other financial incentives to build fee simple housing. And then finally, thinking about, we talked about the impact fees a little bit, adjusting those for smaller units so you're not charging the same amount for an 800 square foot unit in a duplex or triplex as you would for a 3,000 square foot high-end new construction single family home. And then because middle housing is a scale that you can see kind of rookie developers get into, and also you can see home builders that have traditionally only built single family start to dip a toe into middle housing. It can be really helpful. This is one of the places where informational materials can actually have a pretty big impact, I think more so maybe than in some other spaces. And in some cases, having pre-approved plans can reduce barriers for homeowners or folks that might be thinking about, doing development that's, kind of a DIY type of situation. Maybe they're bringing in a contractor, but maybe they're trying not to sell to a developer. And then informational materials to just make it as clear as possible to people. What is allowed? What do I have to do? What's the process going to be like? Thinking about materials that will help walk somebody through what they need to do who isn't a professional developer and maybe hasn't ever done this before. And I think with that, we're going to pause and take questions on the middle housing piece.
Any questions? Please come show us your face and take yourself off mute. Again, I have a question as we're waiting for other people to get brave and come on screen. When the Urban Affairs Committee held their field hearings this summer and took the initial reports from the jurisdictions, one of the things we heard from a couple of them was this notion of reluctance, fear from communities about middle housing. And what that would look like. And just wondering about any thoughts you have on, again, how do you engage the public to help them understand what we're talking about, to address that, I don't want to say NIMBYism, but perhaps NIMBYism of middle housing, and does it fit in our communities?
Go ahead, Tyler. Tyler has tales from the trenches from working on Portland's Residential Infill Project. Years of community conversations and lots of NIMBYs.
I think using good examples of good design, of outcomes that have worked in other places is a good place to start. It's a little hard because a lot of folks will be like, well, that's not my town. That's not this place. And we don't have a lot of great examples of middle housing because it's, again, now just becoming a thing, a policy conversation that we're having. But I think using good examples, using renderings, working with designers and architects to be able to show the relationship of potential middle housing and the scale to existing context, I think is also super helpful. I think the stories, getting back to the sort of the quotes that Becky was talking about in the Housing Action Plan are also super important. I've been amazed when we get to the legislative process of having a city council person be like, well, I live in a duplex and I've lived in a duplex for 20 years and it's great. Or, I had my child come home from college and live in this unit in my house. And I think having some of those stories and personal anecdotes are super helpful to the process. I would say that one of the biggest challenges is the conversation around parking, because it's a major barrier to seeing middle housing, but it's one of the most discussed potential impacts when we have these conversations. And so maybe getting stories from other jurisdictions about how they've seen that play out on the ground is a good place to start.
Tyler,
yeah.
sorry.
Oh, you're good.
My name is Melissa Doherty O'Hara, and I'm a city planner in Kearney, Nebraska. And you've touched the nail on the head right there is about the parking. We don't have any public transit, and we are in that transition where we have a walkable areas of town, but we are still very auto oriented. So what examples do you guys have in communities that are traditionally auto oriented to make that transition?
What example specifically? Becky, can you think of any good cities specifically? I think Eugene's actually a pretty good one. You know, one of the things that I always talk about, and this is sort of my like economic efficiency hat on a little bit right now, is that there's managing the on-street parking system is an important part of this. And that is to some extent an incentive already, that we don't manage or price on-street parking in a way that gets us the built form that we necessarily want. And so oftentimes when these questions come up, we talk more about managing the existing on-street system while also providing as much parking as we can that's physically possible for some of these middle housing types. Becky mentioned the one parking space per unit as a sort of maximum. And I think that that's a good trade-off, honestly. There are other jurisdictions that we've worked with that have far less parking requirements for middle housing and sometimes no parking requirements for middle housing. And so one space per unit seems to be a good place to have that community conversation. And then thinking about on-street management to the extent that that's a thing, and the role that, you know, curb to curb right of way as a public good plays into the thinking about our housing and built form. Becky, do you have any specific examples of places that you would sort of point towards besides your neighborhood?
Yeah. I you know, I live in a neighborhood that has a whole mix of housing types, and you know, I will say, and has great transit and is super walkable. And also people still complain about parking. And I guess one of the things I would add is that I think there are things that you can do to help get people more comfortable with how much parking you would be requiring, particularly if you're kind of in that one per unit space where it's like, yes, everybody will still have one parking space. And if they have a second car, they might park it on the street. And also, I don't know, you know, some neighborhoods have different layouts and things like that, but even in neighborhoods where people have driveways, sometimes people park a car on the street and life generally goes on. And so I think that I think there are ways to help get people a little bit more comfortable. But I guess my experience is also that that works up to a point, and then at a certain point, no amount of data and convincing is really going to eliminate people's fear and their concerns. And then I think you have to think about what can you offer your elected officials who are going to be facing that pressure to counteract it and to counterbalance it. So I think that there are some important considerations that you can bring forward that are like, okay, yes, you one consideration is that people don't like to have other people's cars parked in front of their house. That is true. And also, is it more important for us to have our streets clear of parked cars or for us to have housing for our community? And I think some of the, you know, putting some of the trade-offs forward that if we showing some examples of like, here's how much housing we can fit on the site if we have to have 2 spaces for every unit, and here's how much we can fit if we had to have 1 space for every unit. And can we live with, there may be an extra car or 2 parked on the street some of the time in order to be able to house more of our community. So I think there are some of those things, and also talking, you know, bringing in like for communities that maybe are a little bit more progressive politically, which may or may not be yours. I think sometimes it can help to point out that if you are prioritizing making space for cars, you're continuing to double down on that auto-oriented lifestyle and making it harder for people to walk to things, and continuing to sort of reinforce some of that are auto-oriented and the, you know, long-term greenhouse gas emissions and things like that, if any of those points resonate with your local elected officials, which again, they may or may not. But I think, yeah, at some point in the parking conversation, I think you can bring the best information you can get about parking demand for different unit sizes, and you know, kind of show people examples of neighborhoods that like sometimes have cars parked on the street and generally people don't die. And but then you also, I think at some point have to switch your strategy to just what can I offer as a counterpoint, because those concerns will never completely go away.
Laura, I see you have a question, or Tyler, did you have more? Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say one other thing, and this is as somebody that was city staff at the city of Portland when we adopted our citywide, or had, not when we adopted, I guess, but when we made the recommendation, I was there for the citywide middle housing policy, is really the impacts specific to parking are related to also the rate of change. And I think one of the most impactful things that planners can do is to articulate and really do some thinking and analysis around what's the expected rate of change. And so when we, for example, at the city of Portland, when we allowed duplexes, triplexes, or fourplexes on every single family lot, there was a concern that every single existing single family house was going to get redeveloped. And what we found was that the existing single family house was still what we would call the highest and best use in most cases, and that we were only likely to see one or two duplexes or triplexes or fourplexes on a block. And so if you have one parking space per unit and you're only seeing 8 new units or 6 new units per block, the impact is not as great as, you know, the entire block changing and having a higher demand for parking. So I think the impact related to the rate of change, expected rate of change, is a really important conversation to have.
Laura, did you have a question? I see your face. Okay. You popped up on the screen, so I thought maybe you wanted to ask something.
I'm just trying to be present.
Appreciate it. So, any other questions? I was going to put Derek Miller on the spot. Hopefully, Derek, you're there and can unmute yourself. I was just curious about how, if you had a thought of how the city of Omaha is going to approach its housing action plan.
Yeah, so Becky and Tyler, appreciate all your information. It's great stuff. Love hearing about what we can do. Omaha, we're actually just did interviews to hire a consultant to work on our action plan, our consolidated plan, and then also an update to AFFH, which isn't required anymore, but the impediments still are. So we'll select a consultant here shortly, begin the process next year, and complete it by the end of next year because the state said we had to. So we were at the hearings. I think I'd mentioned that the 866, although cumbersome and maybe could have been written better in a few areas, more clarifying than what it was an opportunity for us to push the housing conversation that over the last few years has been discussed more and more, which is a good thing. I feel is a good thing. So that's how we're approaching it. I know not all communities can afford to hire a consultant. We were lucky enough that we can to do that. So looking forward to the process. Like I said, that won't begin until probably January, February. But there'll be a heavy component of public engagement. And I like the way you said it, Becky, as far as would we like more units to house more of our citizens, or do we want to facilitate more parking? So I'm hoping that we can use this effort to demonstrate the real deficit that we have in Omaha as far as the number of housing units we need to build by a certain date for the different income levels. So it'll push back on all the NIMBYism. That was going to be actually one of my questions is, what are other techniques we can push back? Because we've had a lot of infill, because we've created some innovative zoning tools to allow more infill development, but every infill case we have, we get the same neighbors in the same age bracket, is probably a safe way to say it, that come out. They're homeowners, they're not renters, and they have, in my opinion, I think I'm going to say space here, they have nothing else better to do. And I think a lot of it is around fear. So if there's any information you can help on the NIMBY factor, I would appreciate hearing that. I don't know if that was what you're looking for, Todd. I started with answering it, then I asked a question. So
Appreciate it.
Fair enough. I was going to add one other thought in terms of this sort of gets at the NIMBY question, but in terms of sort of getting people comfortable with middle housing, it may or may not get to the parking piece depending on the situation in your community, but showing people examples of older middle housing, if you do have some, I would say try to skip the 70s, 80s era plexes. Those are generally not the cutest ones. If you happen to have some pre-war middle housing in your community, that can be helpful. I think we like to try to balance the you probably already have this and don't know it, is I think the message of showing people some of that older pre-war housing. I would be a little bit careful not to imply that that's what new middle housing will look like, because it won't generally. But it can help people feel a little bit less threatened. Like, some of your neighbors may have been living next to middle housing for the whole time, and look at their home value is probably still just fine. I know in Portland, some of our highest cost, most desirable neighborhoods are sprinkled with at least pre-war middle housing, and are seeing new construction middle housing as well. And I can vouch for the fact that the home prices continue to escalate on the single family homes in those neighborhoods. If it's a desirable neighborhood, it's a desirable neighborhood, and middle housing doesn't take away from that. Because I think that the concerns you get, definitely parking, and then a perception that it's going to affect my home values. And I think that's where having enough design standards that you're not getting some of the worst 70s, 80s outcomes, but not so much that like everything has to look like a gingerbread house. I think that's one of the things that, if you can focus people a little bit on what they could say yes to, especially if you kind of put some bounds on the conversation. This was one of the nice things in Oregon. House Bill 2001 put some bounds on the conversation that was like, you can't you can't require big lot sizes and low density. You have to, your parking can't be more than 1-to-1. And it kind of put the bounds on to be like, you're in a realm of stuff that's sort of, it's going to generally roughly work or not, but that's sort of up to your market. You're at least not making things unduly burdensome. Now focus your conversation on kind of that last, 10 to 25 to 10% or whatever of, what could you say yes to as far as the design of middle housing, and does it have to be small? What does house scale mean in our community? And some of those conversations, you guys don't have the same bad guy of the legislature is forcing us to do all of the, basically my read of your legislation is that House Bill 2000, the equivalent of Oregon's House Bill 2001, is the stick to get you to do your affordable housing plans, because otherwise you will have to do all of that. But it's not the default, and everyone doesn't have to do it. And so you don't have that same pressure. But I think if you can still say, you know, here are the reasons why middle housing is helpful. If we are going to have middle housing help meet our housing needs, it needs to kind of be within these bounds. What can we say yes to within these bounds? What does feel, you know, what would we want for our community that would make it kind of look more like a single family home or kind of fit within our neighborhood context, and maybe take a little, try to sort of pull the conversation off of it's not going to have enough parking and I can't believe there's going to be 2 units next to me. Tyler, what else would you add to that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I have found most effective is using this housing action plan, housing needs assessment as a baseline setting conversation. I think a lot of people have moved into our cities and our communities at different points in time, and their realities for the affordability of their neighborhood or their city is very different, depending on when folks came into the neighborhood. And so using this housing needs assessment, housing action plan as a way to have a baseline conversation of, this is actually what's happening right now. This is how expensive it is to rent. This is how expensive it is to own. This is how things have changed over the last 10 years. To get everybody on the same page as a public conversation is super helpful, as long as you can have a productive conversation to sort of set that factual basis so everybody's working from the same place. Because that takes some of the conjecture, I think, out of the policy conversation when everybody's on the same page. And so I do think that some of the things that you all are required to do, and I think could do and should do as part of the best practices, can help set that baseline conversation of, there are X amount of households in Omaha that are cost burdened that spend more than 50%, 30% of their monthly income on rent. Housing prices have gone up this amount. This is the average price of housing, so that everybody has the same baseline understanding, and that helps with both the public process and the legislative process with, you know, public testimony and all of that fun times at your planning commission or city council as well. So I think that's, you know, those are the hardest but fun sometimes conversations also to have, is those sort of community-wide conversations about where are we and where do we want to go.
I would say, to Becky's point on examples, AARP Nebraska has partnered with Opticos to develop a missing middle housing walking tour in the Dundee neighborhood of Omaha, which I would say is a very desirable neighborhood of Omaha, that has all of these wonderful examples of middle housing. And I was embarrassed when we went and looked through it, as I've been in that neighborhood, never noticed that these were middle houses. You know, they are part of the neighborhood, they're part of the fiber of it. So we recently worked with MAPA to do an initial tour with some community stakeholders. We'll continue to use that resource. We're actually looking now at doing a video of the walking tour that we can share out to other communities who are further away, to get that sort of, because I think you're exactly right. If you can see what we're talking about, it doesn't look as scary as you may think it is. I talked to several friends who lived in the Dundee neighborhood, and again, they had no clue that this was in their house and in their neighborhood. And suddenly it seemed very cool that this was in their neighborhood. So hopefully more to come on that. So we're getting near the end of the time, but if anyone else has any questions and want to pop on, feel free. Okay, if not, I'm going to really thank Becky and Tyler for your time today. This was a great presentation. I want to let everyone know that we'll have a copy of the slides, and I will get those out to folks. We'll also send out a link to the recording that folks can share out to other folks. We'll, like I said, there were several people who wanted to be on who had conflicts. We'll make sure they get all of this material as well. So Tyler and Becky, thank you very much for your time and your expertise. And anytime you want to come out to Nebraska, we'll show you around.
Sounds good.
Pleasure to
Thank
see
you, everybody.
you all.
Thanks everyone for participating.
Bye.